I'm Alan Thomas. I'm a professor of philosophy here at the University of York, and I'm the ethics lead on our autonomous systems project. And we're very, very pleased to welcome a team from the LSE, Alison Powell, Imre Bard, and Louise Hickman. And they're going to talk to us about interdisciplinary approaches to understanding data and AI ethics from their group Just AI, where Just is the acronym for Joining Up Society and Technology. So without further delay, Alison, would you like to kick us off?
Sure. Thank you so much for the invitation, Alan. I'm really pleased that we could all three be here and tell you a little bit about the work that we've been doing as part of our project and as part of our ongoing work in trying to understand what data and AI ethics means for researchers and practitioners in the UK, and how we can sort of best work with the resources that we already have as an academic and intellectual and practice-based community to expand and enhance the ways that we think about and practice data and AI ethics. So we're going to give a sort of summary of the work that we've been doing. I'm just going to present this and try to share my screen as well. Share screen, this one, and we will go to here we
right
go. Sorry,
top corner.
my windows were layered on top of each other. We're good. So you should be able to now see my slides. So the question that we're working with is this actually a question of both about sort of theory and about practice, which is the question about whether there's an ethical prototype for networking. So I'm going to lead off presenting, although Louise and Imre may Louise will come in at some point, and Imre may also come in. If you don't hear from him during the presentation, he is really pleased to take questions at the end. So we are an independent network of researchers and practitioners, and we are sort of located at the LSE and supported by the Ada Lovelace Institute, which is itself a kind of independent organization that's working on very practical issues around data and AI in the service of the public. And as a kind of public-facing research organization, we are working kind of quite dynamically, both with trying to understand what we have all been doing when we say we're working on data and AI ethics, and also trying to kind of communicate that more effectively, both amongst the very many people who are working on these issues across the country, and also to the public in terms of what they are concerned with. So we have a core team of three of us, plus a range of different researchers who are associated, including a set of 4 Just AI fellows. So in addition to doing the kinds of research that we're going to talk to you about today, which is based on qualitative and quantitative networking research, we also support a fellowship program, which Louise can talk a little more about. These 4 Just AI fellows are working on issues of racial justice from a range of perspectives, including kind of creative, activist, and research perspectives. So we also have some other researchers who have just joined the team who aren't on this page, but this is just to give you an indication of the sort of tentacled way that we also do our work. So what we are primarily interested in is sort of 3 different approaches to networking, or what we call networking with care. And the first is to remake the kinds of networks in which people find themselves embedded when they are trying to do work on data and AI ethics. And your program with TAS Resilience is, of course, like one network inside this bigger set of networks. And so our talk today is going to talk about our approaches to mapping these networks and our beginnings into kind of interventions in making different sorts of spaces within these networks. And the Making Space includes, as I said, our fellowship program. It also includes our working groups that are on kind of emerging themes with it that are coming out in the field that Louise will speak to. And we also have a number of kind of public events that have run in the past and will continue to run, which are part of kind of capacity building around emerging issues. I am going to apologize. I'm having building work done on my house and there is hammering. And so please wave at me if you can't hear what I'm saying because the hammering is interfering. So to start, I wanted to talk about how we're remaking networks. We started this project about 10 months ago with an initial survey of people who were self-identifying as being interested in or working on data and AI ethics in the UK. And we got 126 responses, of which 113 were based in the UK. Most of them were coming from London. But we did have a pretty wide range of organizations that people came from in this first mapping. 34 different academic institutions, mostly universities, but also places like the Turing Institute, some private companies, some government bodies, and some media organizations. So what we saw from this initial mapping was that the idea of, the space of data and AI ethics research and practice, people who were thinking about and identifying themselves as working in this space, was highly interdisciplinary and was covering a sort of full spectrum of disciplines across the arts and humanities, the social sciences, engineering, medicine, and psychology. And our project is funded by the AHRC, as I mentioned, and is also meant to be a humanities-led project. And I have a background in media and communication studies, as does Louise, and the kinds of humanities traditions that are kind of relevant for me are ones that come from literature, from critical theory, and also from art and design. Louise's influences are different. Imre comes from methodology and then previously from philosophy. So between the three of us, have a pretty wide view of what constitutes the humanities. And so when we started thinking about how to be a humanities-led networking project, we really wanted to emphasize a kind of this creative thinking and rethinking that's part of the critical approaches that we learn in the humanities, and part of that idea about like looking not just at the social world as a social scientist, which I am now, but also looking at the world in terms of its kind of meaning and trying to understand what is going on. So when we got these survey results, we thought, well, we should really try and figure out a little more about who these people are. This is the moment in the talk where I have a COVID parentheses. We had originally planned to do a number of kinds of a very structured and specific seminar series that was explicitly intended to bring people together in interdisciplinary settings to look at challenging problems that cut across disciplines. And as we started thinking about how to do this, the pandemic hit, and I was suddenly in back-to-back Zoom meetings all day long, and I realized that the approach that I wanted to take would be so, would give people the impression that they had to attend yet another Zoom meeting, and we may not actually achieve this interdisciplinary conversation in the way that we wanted. So we thought we would take a slightly different approach and more slowly move towards building out this kind of wider interdisciplinary conversation. So we went to go and look at who had published in the field, who they were collaborating with, and what their connections were. So we basically started doing some social network analysis and social network mapping. And we started by scraping data about individuals and their affiliations and their research profile from publicly available information that was on the web. And as Imre will tell you, when you have a longer discussion about this, this was extremely labor intensive. And this is more or less what it looked like when people started to map it. This is my profile. So it's possible, yes, to scrape this information. And you can see on the right-hand side of the slide some of the information that we were trying to extract out of public profiles so that we could understand better who was in the field. And you can then see in the middle some of the kinds of visualizations that we were playing around with to see how we might be kind of connected to other people in this field. All of this mapping by hand raised issues around consent, around reinforcement of power structures. It's very low efficacy. It both draws on and creates very incomplete and scattered data. It is basically immediately outdated, and there are many questions around inclusion and exclusion that this raised. And as we were looking at ethics, we thought there must certainly be a better way of doing this. So we looked at doing a couple of different using a couple of different networking methodologies to answer different questions here, looking not just at the social structure, but also at the thematic and conceptual structure of what people were writing about or working on or describing themselves as writing about or working on. So we started looking at both kind of mapping the prominence of institutions and individuals and at co-authorship networks, as well as at citation clusters, term co-occurrence mapping, and topic modeling. And we thought about how we could also do this over time. And this is probably not a surprise to any of you, but this is sort of indicative of the growth of publications related to AI and data ethics in the past decade, which also gives you a sense of what we've been having to contend with, doing this work. And this is, hey, Imre, do you want to just pop in and speak to this slide for a second? Because I'm worried I'm not going to describe it appropriately.
Yes, so hello everyone. This is Imre here. So this is really meant to be just an illustration of the kind of network visualizations that we are generating, and this in particular shows kind of co-authorship network for papers that were derived from 5 sources that we looked at: the Web of Science database, the ACM database, SSRN, the preprint archive, and Archive, another preprint repository, and Springer Link. And we conducted searches for a bunch of technical keywords such as AI, artificial intelligence, machine learning, deep learning, reinforcement learning, a set of these technical keywords in combination with a small number of keywords that we took to represent ethics, and we deliberately chose a rather restricted set of keywords, so ethics, ethical, moral, and virtue. And even that resulted in a set of over 6,000 papers. So this is really just zooming in on a small subsection of this co-authorship network to show some of the most prominent figures in the field. And this is kind of a dense central part of that network. And there is a really wide ranging, well, not a wide ranging, but a huge number of tiny co-authorship networks kind of scattered around. Yeah, I think I can pass back to Alison.
Thanks, Imre. So yeah, it is a very interesting field, right? Because it's a hugely expansive field, but then there's obviously like these very dense and small little clusters of kind of co-authorship networks where people are working on particular problems. And that is also just in itself quite an interesting feature of this emerging field. But one of the other interesting features that's kind of like more significant for us in terms of our work is that research and publication networks are still siloed. And this is a visualization which is quite beautiful, I think. And I just, again, need to check with Imre, but I believe that the large cluster on the right is papers that are looking at the concept of or keyword of justice in relation to a kind of like broad interpretation of data and AI ethics, whereas the ones that are on the left-hand side in the sort of small fan array are papers that are centrally that are connected to a specific concept of data justice. Is that right, Imre?
Yes. So the bigger kind of bursty network is the one that is showing the set of papers that were mentioning justice as a keyword derived from this broader set of papers that I described before, which we have labeled the AI ethics dataset. And then this other set, as Alison said, is looking specifically at the issue of data justice. And I guess what we can see here is that the connection between the two is very sparse. So these are kind of separate discussions that are taking place with only a very small number of authors kind of acting as bridges between the two.
Thanks, Imre. Yeah, and I think what I think this means overall for the field is that there are these kinds of like small silos where people are working on a concept that might be really relevant to a larger group of people, but that larger group of people has very few links to the group of researchers that's working on that sort of specific concept. And in the case of justice, or thinking about data justice, the sort of concept which is represented by that sort of fan-shaped, like left-hand network of papers, is elaborating a really interesting position that could be very valuable for the kind of broader field as a whole. But there's that really weak set of connections. So we're trying to figure out what to do, to try to sort of shift around the relationships and increase the sorts of conversations between these different parts of the bigger network. And the kind of limitations of this particular approach, looking quantitatively at all of this, is of course that, again, this kind of messy data, there's a lot of differences in citation cultures, particularly across disciplines, as I'm sure you've noted in your own, research group. Not all of the relevant work that we're interested in appears in academic outputs, and when we're mapping, we can only kind of get out what we put in. So the search terms that we're using, for example, search terms around how we are in fact trying to define the field of data and AI ethics, it depends on, turning up papers that are related to certain keywords. So we thought one of the ways that we could address this would be to release our results and open them up to be critiqued and to be expanded, and to find other ways to kind of open up the conversations that are at play within this sort of bigger network of researchers. So we have a couple of plans in this area. We will be trying to release the data sets that we have produced through this mapping. And we've only shown you a very small number of the visualizations that we've done of these like very small sections of these networks, partly because they're extremely dense. And so looking at a very dense network requires some work to parse through. But we also wanted to open up our project in other ways. So we have designed a supplementary research tool, which is becoming, in this new phase of our project that we're heading into, one of our main research tools, which is called a reflective survey. And I think we can pop the link to this in the chat. Is that gonna work? Can we put that in? So this is our invitation to you in this seminar. You are the very first people that we are inviting to pilot this reflective survey. The purpose of this reflective survey is to help us to try to figure out how to make those bridges between different parts of the field, and also to understand the kinds of work that goes into research on data and AI ethics that can't be captured by our institutional identities through the scraping that we did in the first round, nor through the kinds of available data that is produced through our bibliometric analysis, which has been our sort of second phase. We actually really want to know more about how people understand themselves and what they have been doing in relation to other people. And this idea of the relational qualities that we have between each other is also a big part of the kind of philosophy underpinning our project. And so we have been thinking quite a lot about relational ethics and about the kinds of things that happen when you are looking not just at individuals, as you do with network mapping, but also communities and the changing nature of ideas. So we think about networking as a kind of reflective tool rather than a kind of descriptive tool. And we are interested in networking as a way for many stakeholders to imagine different types of engagement with research. And this is a sort of way of positioning our mandate, not just to understand and intervene in the field of data and AI ethics, but also to kind of communicate some of the issues that are of significance in this field to different stakeholders, including people beyond academia, industry, and other forms of practice. So as you are hopefully now all wandering through our survey, we would like to tell you a little bit about what the final survey is going to produce for people who finish it. And so these are some sketches of prototype visualizations that will appear at the end of the survey and that are meant to kind of accompany the questions that you will now have seen. And these are kind of intended to give people the idea that their answers are not like right or wrong. They're not segmenting them into one particular place. They're just sort of building out an identity, which is a kind of part of an identity that many people share. So a more elaborated version of what the people who fill out this survey in the next round will receive at the end of the survey is that everyone will get a little picture of their own personal rhizome that they have grown through responding to the survey. And this is a key that shows some of the ways that we will be trying to visually present the responses to this survey so that people can see a little bit like how their own perspective on the work that they're doing in the field can be described. And the reason we're asking you all to pilot the survey is in part so that we can have these little sort of personal versions of, what does your own contribution to the field look like? We're also going to be able to present those alongside a kind of view of the aggregate of all of the people who have already filled out the survey. So this is us sort of moving into a new space of trying to engage with the kinds of practices of many people and the identities of many people who are working in this field. So I guess this is the point where I think I can hand over to Louise to talk a little bit about some of the other parts of our project and the other ways that we have been working with this idea of remaking networks and kind of networking with care. Louise, do you want to drop in and explain a little bit more about the other parts of our project?
Yeah, thank you for providing such a good framework. You're going to have to do the slides though, Alison. I don't have access to it.
That's fine. You just tell me. You just say next slide anytime you want me to change. Okay, Louise?
Okay. All right. So I just want to kind of go back to the diagram that Imre had generated based around justice and data justice. And so that's a really nice area or kind of one part of what Imre has been doing and gathering all this kind of work is really thinking about how one might situate themselves in the field. And so the interesting relationship between data justice and data, justice and data justice, that's mind is that the data just citations have emerged in the last maybe 10 years. And that should be kind of framed by the Data Justice Lab that has emerged in Cardiff. But it's worth thinking about how the kind of citational networks are building. In another sense, in some of the next part that I'm going to be touching on is thinking about where are these centers gathering? Because in the data justice kind of citation network, there is a lot of kind of influence of environmentalism and development studies. And these are like two areas that are kind of emerging within that subset, if you like. And those subsets are driven by these clusters of people that have these specialties and that may perhaps are kind of centered around the lab or a practice of engaging with particular subjects. And I think this is like a really kind of interesting part of our project, is really thinking about how do we build out the kind of understanding of how the citation network begin to gather, and the kind of outward looking and thinking about, well, what are our own influences? So I think, you know, it's really useful that Alison had used the last two slides where to begin to kind of diagram what your actual responses will be when you fill in the survey, and we can begin to work with designers to actually really think about not yourself as individual set of data, but how you might relate to somebody else within the network. So this kind of shift, and I think the first prototype that we came up with, so the really played around with the idea of how you relate to others, is actually we use an essay structure. So you would put in, it's like using a kind of toggle between my first language, third language, kind of where, you know, so, my name is X, I work in X, I am not an ethicist. So we really use that idea to kind of build out where somebody might be situated. And then some of those questions, there was an opportunity to call on junior colleagues as a way to surface particular people in the field that are not necessarily recognized by citations. So I think that in many ways really begins to kind of frame like this idea of the, and I think that I kind of mourn this moment that Alison was talking about earlier, is what if this project kind of unfolded outside of COVID? You know, how would it, where would it look different? How would our practices be different, you know? So getting back to, if we go forward to the racial justice fellows, this was the moment in the early stages of the project where we recognized that we weren't able to surface particular scholars working on racial justice within ethics. So we really asked right questions around, well, how do we kind of intervene in ways that we can think about how other people like these fellows can intervene in this space. So this is in some sense a kind of emergence of what we would hope to have been able to achieve many months earlier. And so the fellows, Jasmine, Irene, and Sarah, and Squirrel Nation are all working on different projects related to racial justice and ethics. We have a couple of creative projects. Jasmine is doing another type of map survey like kind of diagramming, where she's very interested in shadow mapping. So you have the kind of formal infrastructures and very much what we're doing, but who is in the background, who's in the shadows. Kind of an interesting metaphor. So rather than going into all the different projects, I want to move to the next slide, Alison. Yeah, so we're, and again, building capacity is like a way of networking with care. And each of us, Imre and I and Alison, have a working group that focus on the particular areas. And I'm going to spend maybe the next 5 minutes talking about automation of vulnerability. And the next part of the title is data rights, access and refusal. And so if we can move to the next slide, Alison. So I actually want to kind of use this image here, which is an image that is related to the Accessible Icon project, which is based in the States, run by Sarah Hendren. And what I want to do right in this image is just kind of describe this image as a way of thinking about emerging in networking opportunities and citation networks. It's for my project working on automation of vulnerability, which of course is responding to some of the questions that have raised for disability studies scholars, health-related scholars in the time of COVID. So, you know, that it's been definitely a tech response to the definition of vulnerability. So in the working group that I've set up, we begin to challenge what vulnerability means for different stakeholders, right? And now we're fleshing out what vulnerability means for somebody with a disability, what vulnerability means for a practitioner who is working with data, and so forth. But the image here is really interesting, and I really like this image now as a way of describing an aspect of our project, is that you have the international wheelchair symbol in the background, which is a symbol that was designed in the 1960s, which actually didn't have a head, actually. I'm just going to point that out. And a few years later, it had a head. Okay, so you're really thinking about autonomy and thinking about agency and so forth. But Sarah Hendon project is selected a group of people and they all made their own stencils, and using these stencils they overlaid the kind of 1960 UN defined wheelchair symbol with their own symbol. And so this symbol is a symbol that is engaging with action. There is a motion of action, very much challenging the conceived ideas around disability. And what's interesting in this aspect is if we're thinking about practice, which is in the background of all this kind of our project, is practice is the fundamental core of our project, and thinking how we can think through the various aspects of our project. But this image is interesting because it's practice in the background of these kind of institutional practice, institutional knowledges, and how do we come into that field and how we begin to unravel those institutional knowledges. So recently, Sarah Hendon, the kind of director of this project, had recently wrote a book on what a body can do. Again, challenging the conceptions around disability and what a body can do. And in a recent event, and this is kind of like an extension of how this network is supposed to unfold, in the sense that this event, Access as a Responsibility, as shown here, is a conversation between somebody in an industry position, Sarah Drinkwater, and Sarah Hendon, having a conversation. So they're reframing disability access as a way of thinking about how we can think this in relation to responsible technology. And doing so, we can resurface different types of questions. And so those questions were really focusing on standardization and scale, co-authorship, or the kind of ethics around that. So I know that this slide can be an actual talk in itself. So I am now going to step backwards and rein it in, and I'm going to hand it back to Alison as a way to kind of bring everything together.
Oh, great, Louise. Now you're going to leave me with the like, how do we tie all of these threads together?
I can help.
Can you help? Good. Because as you can tell from our talk, we have a very expansive notion of what networking means, and our kind of notion of networking is both kind of multidisciplinary, and also it's like it draws on many different epistemologies. Both ones that are kind of looking at, what is already produced, and how you understand the world in terms of the data that is already produced about things that are happening in the social world. And of course, that is what drives this idea of using mapping methods and social networking methods. But we're also, as I said before, really drawing from this kind of constructivist epistemology of the world always coming into being, And we're trying to, engage with these two epistemological perspectives at the same time, in a way that we hope will be engaging for lots of people, and also to help people to understand that these fields that we are working in, because they bring up these extremely complex, or what we have sometimes called wicked problems. My own working group is on redefining concepts of justice in terms of redefining sustainability in terms of different notions of justice, including intergenerational justice, environmental justice, and spatial justice. And thinking about those kinds of questions around the concept of sustainability as it appears sort of in, not just in environmental philosophy, but also in the different kinds of practices that technicians are using to develop AI technologies. Imre's leading the working group on ethics in practice, and I'm sure he can say more, but I know he has an interest in the kinds of entanglements between different perspectives on, what is, when do things happen in practice, and what are the entanglements between different actors in public and private sectors, and is there a sort of moment in technical design or development where ethics in practice becomes possible in a certain way. So because we have this very expansive view and this kind of very multi-perspectival approach, I think, of course, we have to really remain open. And that's why it's just really a delight to have been able to explain a little bit about our project to you. These are some things that we're going to be doing in the next couple of months. We'll be talking about our public engagement, which is around using science fiction narratives to explore the different kinds of ethical aspects of AI at the Paris Colloquium on AI Fiction. And in the week of the 21st of June, we're actually hosting a week-long event called Prototyping Ethical Futures, where we're convening conversations around all of our working groups and launching the full version of the survey that you have been so kindly invited to pilot. So you can join our mailing list, you can follow us on Twitter, you can send us a lot of emails. Imre will answer them and then ask me if we have actually responded to them yet. Or you can just ask us any questions you have now, because I'm finished with all the things I had to say and look forward to the discussion.
Thanks very much. Okay, shall I open up the discussion? We can do this one of two ways. You can raise your hand virtually, or you can put any comments or queries in the chat. Bernd has a question.
Yes, well, thank you very much for the presentation. I'd like to come back to the earlier overview of the social network. And you said that there are disciplinary differences in terms of how people relate to each other and how they cite each other. So what I'd be interested in is to understand whether the pattern of network relationships that you've shown are typical for humanities or whether they are atypical. So I mean, do philosophers generally not cite each other very much, and is that therefore what you would expect, or is this sort of an outlier?
Sorry, could you repeat
this question?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you to maybe repeat the very last bit of your question, because I couldn't hear that, like the last sentence. Yeah,
no, just, I mean, in my experience, philosophers don't cite each other a lot anyway. They never do, right? But I have absolutely no evidence for that. It's just an observation, a personal one. And so what the gist of the question is this abnormal, or do you just know, is that what you would observe elsewhere as well?
So actually, this observation about citation cultures being different across disciplines is not necessarily something that we observe directly, but something that is discussed with regard to like different disciplinary traditions that people cite in different ways. So in some traditions, people cite there's kind of strategic citation going on, of course, and at different career stages, people cite differently. So there is just a wide variety of factors that influence how people cite, which is a general limitation of kind of bibliometric methodologies to draw conclusions about multiple disciplines at the same time. But actually what you raised, this question about philosophers not citing each other, is something that is very, very, very interesting, and something that I will now look into in more detail, but I don't think I can give you a robust answer at this point. But this is extremely interesting, so I will look at that specifically.
Okay, thank you.
I'm happy to get back to you.
Yeah, also I wasn't aware that philosophers didn't cite each other, because in this field of data and AI ethics, there are some influential people who are sort of positioned as philosophers, or who self-identify as philosophers, like Luciano Floridi. And he is very, very heavily cited by other people across this network. And I actually wonder whether, if it is anecdotally or perhaps empirically true that philosophers in other parts of philosophy don't tend to cite each other, then that's a very big difference for somebody who's working in this sort of more interdisciplinary field of data and AI ethics. Or perhaps Luciano is just particularly good at positioning his work in a way that makes it citable.
I think that there's a strong argument for that to be made, that Luciano is the outlier, he's not the norm. And I'm just looking also at other disciplines. So I work a lot, for example, with neuroscientists, and where this is just utterly different. The way they approach citations is just nowhere near what philosophers would do. But I have no evidence, so I have no data for that. That's just my anecdotal observation.
So I'm going to abuse my position and jump in as the chair, because I think my questions are along the same lines as Bernd's, really. So it's a kind of a presupposition that siloed research is a bad thing. But when you look at the way in which disciplines are patterned, for one thing, we have the priority rule to organize scientific inquiry. We organize scientists into competitive teams. Now, you might think that's a very bad idea, but it's certainly what we do. The first discoverer of a result gets all the credit, the glory, and the Nobel Prize. And whoever comes second gets nothing. There are prestigious and non-prestigious areas of science. There are commercial imperatives in the background in this kind of field, as there is in medicine and medical research. And this is a very young emerging field. So again, I think I've got kind of Bernd's suspicion that there's nothing surprising in this picture at all. And if I map physics, would it look different?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, one of our question was not actually whether this was a distinctive field. Our question was, what can we tell about the actors in this field using this method? And so it is possible, indeed actually quite probable, that the dynamics of these networks are comparable to the dynamics of other networks of other researchers working in similar sorts of fields. Ones with, the qualities you mentioned, emerging, with potential commercial imperatives, and with, a certain amount of cross-disciplinary collaboration. But our job was also to create a way to network people across disciplines, and to kind of curate conversations that might, under other circumstances, not have occurred. And so for this reason, we thought we would actually try to find out about, where would the potential for those conversations be? And that's the purpose of the mapping. The purpose of the mapping is not necessarily in itself to discover that this is a wildly different arrangement than it might be in neuroscience, for example.
Okay, thank you. Carlos had a question.
Oh yeah, I was almost in the same topic area. I remember I saw a study in search-based software engineering a while ago. And the findings in the network analysis was almost the same. There are clusters, very influential people, and publications revolve around these mega nodes. And I was under the assumption that, most of science works that way. And I'm wondering if you found that there's something special, unique in the ethics for AI domain. Do you think it's especially bad for this domain that this works that way? Or this clustering is unique for some reason?
I think that where we see the importance, maybe, or the relevance of this clustering is that when we look at So we took a kind of deliberately rather narrow interpretation of ethics, because one of the first learnings that we derived from the initial survey that we ran, where we asked people to describe their own work in terms of keywords, was that there's like an enormous number of keywords, an enormous number of topics that people use to describe their work as falling under the very broad category of kind of AI ethics. And it was actually very hard for us to construct, and almost impossible to construct, a sort of sensible search strategy from those hundreds and hundreds of keywords that people defined. It wasn't, and it even wasn't always clear whether they would say that what they defined as their topic of research, in their view, falls under AI and data ethics. So we took this deliberately kind of narrow interpretation of AI ethics, and we wanted to look at what are the sorts of things that people are discussing within that interpretation of ethics, which in itself, although being limited, is huge. As I said, thousands and thousands of people fall into that limited understanding. And then if we look, for example, at something like data justice, the interesting, or maybe the important finding is that there is a certain set of concepts and there are certain perspectives that people are discussing in another domain that you might say is or should be related to discussions about AI ethics, but there is a disconnect there. So, and because of the societal relevance and the societal importance of AI and data-driven technologies, there might be a case made for why this sort of clustering and this siloing is maybe not advantageous if we try to kind of address the societal problems that go along with these technologies, because people are discussing important issues disconnected from other people who are purportedly working on the same topic. So as Alison said, I guess the goal of this was not so much to see whether this is unique and different to other areas of science, but because of the societal relevance of trying to cover a broad base of important issues, it's important for us to try to overcome these disciplinary and methodological clusters and silos. I don't know if that answers, kind of goes towards answering the point.
Yeah, it does. Thanks.
Colin has a question.
Hi there. Thank you very much for the talk. I guess when we're looking at the networks that we've seen earlier, there's almost an implied assumption here that what we're trying to do is, the underlying approach here is trying to improve research. Is that right? Yeah. So we've used words like importance. And I wonder if you have in your mind already, in going into this, what it means to have better research in this work, what it means to increase important research. So are we looking for wider study, deeper study? Do you have some idea on what the ideal network will look like at the end? Is there some kind of driving hypothesis behind this that will say, yes, we're able to get better research in terms of ethics and AI?
Well, the remit that we were given, the sort of backstory of the project is that the Ada Lovelace Institute and the AHRC had sketched out a kind of, a brief essentially, and they said, well, we'd really like to have somebody, work a little bit on this, creating a network of people working in this area. And primarily the problem space was really about interdisciplinarity. And so in that sense, that's why we went with a kind of connective metaphor and these kinds of connective methods. Personally, I feel that the networking is largely descriptive. I mean, we are not really doing an analysis of these networks. They are descriptive, and the analysis, the sort of actual analytic work of the project is in creating the kinds of conversations and possible spaces for encounters across and between different clusters, and also to focus on those linking people and to look a little bit at what those linking people are doing and trying to understand how they do their work, because those are the people who are clearly making connections. So the answer to your question is, defining the better here is is really about equality of different forms of connection across difference. And I think it would be impossible essentially to map as much as we would need to map to know whether to empirically prove, what with this kind of quantitative method that we were achieving this. So instead we have other metrics to determine how well we are doing at kind of creating these different spaces for conversation and for linkage across difference. And one of them is to look a little bit at who responds to our survey. And the results of that survey will also help us to create different communication channels and different platforms for people to have ongoing discussions. Also to try to find people who are working on similar things to them from a different perspective, again, to kind of like hone in on that linkage. And as Louise described, actually really identify in specific areas where we actually have the expertise that allows us to assess this, to actually kind of create and curate interventions that do that linkage work. So Louise's, case study of her working group really describes very well and precisely, how kind of convening people from several different universities with different perspectives, plus somebody from outside the university, getting them all to work together on a document that defines a set of, shared research topics. That's the real work.
Can I just add a little footnote there? I think it's interesting because in the early days where we were grappling with how we were going to do this work, every now and again we would get a request for to identify a speaker for a particular panel on AI ethics. And what was interesting that we kept coming back to the same person who was be specializing on racial justice. And so in that sense, that's where the project comes to life. So we're trying to find ways of identifying and surfacing different types of engagement, different perspectives. So I think this had a forward trajectory because it's about doing the deeper work and sustaining those connections, but it's like trying to find ways that those particular people can be identified, but we're not always calling on the same people. Yeah, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and it kind of, if I may just do a slight follow-up to that, I wonder if out of this you're going to be able to identify some key drivers for these relationships, and what is it that makes particular topics and relationships happen, and what it is that needs to happen to make relationships happen. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think this is interesting because I think actually I didn't really foreground it in the part I was presenting on, was that the fellows themselves have a lab space. And so we do a lot of kind of intense work in that space where we meet every so often and we go over presentations. So I think that is like a way of working that is about sustaining that. And I think I'm becoming quite interested in the ideas of how lab work in the humanities is different from science labs. So like what different types of questions do we ask, how reflexive we are of the questions that we might bring to the lab. They're not the same type of questions that you might have in a kind of science lab, right? So I guess that is again a shift in the kind of perspective building that we've been doing as well.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you so much, Colm, for your sort of questions about the drivers of relationships and the conditions for those. It's going to be that's really thought-provoking.
Thank you.
Any further questions?
I'm going to plug the show. Oh, somebody else is going to speak.
Okay, well, the team has shared their survey in the chat. So can I draw your attention to that link? Clearly, it would be very helpful to the ongoing conversation if you could help them out with some further data
really
about.
helpful. And also, I realize we've kind of given you a whistle-stop tour of, you know, like a very expansive project. So if you come up with a question that you have later, or you want to ask us something else about, you know, where there are many parts of the project we didn't present today, you know, from this sort of public engagement work to some more details about the kind of lab-based approach that Louise alluded to, that's kind of trying to create these conditions of possibility for discussions more broadly. And also, like, we realized that you also have a network. And so I'm also very happy to talk to anybody who wants to talk to me about how you have been, you know, running your events and where your membership comes from and how you think about the ways that you all work together.
Right, so would you like me to continue, Alan?
Could you take over, Radu?
Yes. So
Thanks.
I wanted to thank you again, Alison and Louise and Imre, for the nice and insightful presentation. I wish you best of luck with the project. So we are looking forward to hearing about, learning about the results, the outcomes of the project. I want to encourage people to make a note of the URL to the survey pilot. I tried to start completing it, but then I couldn't follow the presentation any longer. So I thought I would leave that for after the talk. I felt better that way, so I can pay full attention to the presentation. So this will disappear, but it is now in the chat. So if you click on the link, you will have that loaded in your browser, and you can complete the survey after the talk. I know that you have a hard stop at 4 p.m., Alison, but if there are any final questions, please ask them now, or otherwise, please join me in thanking the presenters. And I'm looking forward to seeing you at the next seminar in 2 weeks' time.